Okay, thanks, Molly. Can you hear me?
Fairly clear.
Okay, great. Thanks for the warm introduction. And if we can skip to the next slide, please. We're a bank, so everything we put out has a disclaimer. So when the materials come out afterwards, you can read that at your own pace. Next slide, please. Okay, it's always worth looking at the international context when talking about hydrogen, just to understand how quickly the sector's moving and the commitment of many countries to make this a reality. The target of net zero by 2050, which a number of European countries in particular, but also Japan and South Korea and others are making, are driving a massive effort to decarbonize. Now, some of that's going to come through changes to energy efficiency, so we use the power that we're producing more usefully. Some of it's going to be through increasing the fleet of renewable energy plants to displace existing thermal plants, and we'll see quite rapid exits from market for older coal and gas-fired and oil-fired power plants. And we're seeing in Australia at the moment a very rapid increase in wind and solar. We'll also see a need to replace fuels that can't be electrified with other sources, whether it's hydrogen or biofuels. And that's all part of the spectrum of things that have to be dealt with over the next 30 years. And Europe and a number of other countries are really pushing this pretty hard. And we're starting to see some real activity in the electrolyzer manufacturing industry, where we're starting to see a number of companies starting to make big commitments to production facilities to be able to build electrolyzers at significant scale and be part of the key inputs to this industry. Next slide, please, Molly. So we can see changing from consumer use, industry use, transport use. We're going to see a step up in electrification, and we're probably going to see a similar amount of the heavy lifting needed to be done by hydrogen, methanol, biofuels, and we'll increasingly see carbon offsets still be part of the overall picture, which allows a little bit of fossil fuels to be used for the things that are almost impossible to decarbonize. So that's a 30-year journey. Next slide, please. And Japan's a very organized country, and they've got this plan to develop 14 key industry sectors, and you'll see many of these touch themes you'll hear about around the hydrogen debate, whether it's hydrogen for power generation or fuel ammonia to be able to burn in turbines or boilers. One level, obviously, an interest in nuclear power and offshore wind as well to supplement that energy production, but we're also seeing a focus on the shipping industry to be able to have hydrogen or ammonia fuel cell ships, electric ships as well, which might be more appropriate for shorter distance things like coastal ferries. Also seeing a big focus on transportation, and whether it's rail, road, and also we're starting to see a focus on can we decarbonize the aviation industry. And there's also focus on how we can reduce the carbon footprint from the residential and housing sectors. So that's a significant roadmap to achieve that zero net carbon by 2050 in Japan, and a lot of that's obviously going to touch on this debate today around hydrogen playing a big part in that future industry. Next slide, please. So we can see a fairly rapid rollout of a number of significant demonstration and pilot projects in Japan. There's about 14 on this picture, and we're seeing a similar initiative starting in Australia through the ARENA grant awards that have been made in the last few months to facilitate demonstration scale projects, and hopefully further funding rounds that will be able to support further scale up of those projects from the 1 to 10 megawatts up to the 10 to 100 and potentially beyond. Next slide, please. Japan's got its own hydrogen association, which is, I guess, similar in nature to the Australian one. It's got a purpose to be a cross-industry collaboration to be able to improve the entire supply chain and create a significant hydrogen society within Japan. And it's drawn its management board from across industry, including traditional oil and gas companies, Iwatani and ENEOS, original equipment manufacturers like Kawasaki Heavy, electric utilities, steel and motors, motor industry, and our holding company, Sumitomo Mitsui Financial Group, is part of that management board too. So it's something that's getting attention around executive management in Tokyo, that the bank is going to play a role in the hydrogen sector in Japan, but also more globally. Next slide, please. And that step was actually taken a little earlier than that. That was back in September 2018, when the bank joined the Global Hydrogen Council that had only been established in January 17. We joined as a supporting member in September 2018. And again, that's showing that there's a big focus within parts of the finance industry that this is seen as being a sector that can make a huge difference to the energy transition, and we need to get in there early and play a role in opening up the market. And next slide, please. So it's early days in a new industry. What's making it something that's going to be attractive to financiers? And we heard from the previous presenter, and we'll hear from the Minister up next, that supportive government policies are key to getting the industry off the ground. Having a vision that's significant is one thing, but creating policy frameworks and roadmaps will actually help people along that journey. Having hard targets like net zero is a significant goal, and it does need big projects to make that happen. And having fellow travelers, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and others on that journey means that others are making the investments and forcing along the technology down the learning curve and getting the efficiency and cost improvements that will make the industry viable in the long run without additional support, financial or grant money. And getting through that initial industry development and being able to stand on a true competitive market basis is going to be key in the long run to people's confidence and willingness to invest. We're seeing also a lot of our customers making investments in the sector, whether it's in setting up development teams, getting early stage development projects up and running. We're seeing research and development, we're seeing partnerships formed. So we're seeing that hubbing of large corporations and smaller ones too, with ideas to get projects up and off the ground. And that's creating opportunity for us. That at the end of the day, financiers are just providing capital. It's the customers, our customers, that actually create the projects and the physical assets and the opportunity for us to invest money and support them. and seeing that big interest in the sector, and from a lot of great names that was on the slide at the very beginning that Molly, you put up for everyone to see who was in the audience. And industry attractiveness in the long run. It needs to be an industry that is producing good earnings and has a future of good earnings. We've seen some industries like solar photovoltaics, where it's become a very large industry, but it's become highly commoditized in the manufacturing of cells and panels, and that the industry profitability is actually not that fantastic. What we'd like to see is an industry that is able to create good, sustainable levels of earnings, because that's what makes the industry bankable. Next slide, please. And there's other influences on banks. You're seeing an awful lot of coverage at the moment in the press and media more generally around ESG targets and ESG principles affecting financial institutions, whether it's fund managers, where they invest in equities or into bonds, and whether it's banks and which businesses they're supporting. And we're just going through the Australian banking annual results period, and we'll see greater focus on the ESG statements that are coming out of banks through that reporting season. We're seeing changes in portfolios that we're seeing focuses on growing value through different industry streams, and as one industry maybe declines through that decarbonisation journey, others will step up to replace that. So if we reduce our exports of hydrocarbons, can we replace that by the export of hydrogen molecules instead, to do essentially a lot of the same purpose? And seeing an industry that can create large assets and real value for end-use customers will lead to a lot of potential liquidity from the finance sector to support the construction of these new large projects and assets on the ground. And thinking through risk, there's nothing that we haven't been through on other elements of the energy transition. Thinking back 20 years ago, the first commercial wind farms were being built in Australia, and they were starting off pretty small. I remember the first one I worked on was about 18 megawatts, and the next one was 56. Now we've seen that Australia's already constructed projects over 500 megawatts as a single project in the wind sector. We're seeing a number of 400 megawatt plus projects in operation. And we're talking about 1,000 megawatt onshore projects, realistically getting into construction in the next 12 months, and potentially offshore wind projects up to 2,000 megawatts by 2025. So it's a huge scale up in the space of 20 to 25 years, from less than 20 megawatts to 2,000 megawatts. And with that's coming an experienced manufacturing and construction sector that's been able to scale up over time. It's been faster on the solar side. We've gone from early projects in 2014 of 20 megawatts, and we've got a 400 megawatt solar project, or two 400 megawatt solar projects in construction now. So it's likely that compression of timeline in wind over 20 years, solar maybe over 6 years, hydrogen, there's an awful lot of interest in the sector. Can we see that sort of scale up pace that we're seeing in other sectors? We'll see a mirroring of some of the commercial structures from the power sector, but also from the LNG export sector at play in the bigger hydrogen for export. But we'll also see a lot of assets on corporate balance sheets as things are built for the domestic market, and displacing, for example, some of the hydrocarbons in the natural gas pipeline with hydrogen molecules instead. Next slide, please. So the key things when building new large assets is making sure there's a very clear planning framework set by government and regulators, and that the engineering standards are very clearly understood. The things that tend to go wrong is when you haven't got all your permits or authorizations before you start construction. And we're seeing that at the moment. The risk in the renewable sector, that's the biggest one at the moment, is getting your registration to generate, which you can't get before you start building. And we're seeing projects being delayed by up to 2 years in getting that final authorization to be able to start their generation. And that's a huge cost to a project and something we really don't want to see happening at all. And hopefully the electricity sector can get its act in order and improve that registration process, but it's something we need to bear in mind when looking at a new sector. Construction, it comes down to having strong contractors with the right skills and motivation for them want to invest resources in supporting a new sector being built up. Investment in project management to be able to manage large complex projects, and for owners and for financiers to get expert engineering advice, and that build up of expertise in the consulting engineering industry is going to be a key. And getting the right commercial structures to be able to allocate risk between owners, suppliers, contractors and customers is something that we look at as an everyday thing. We just have to apply it to a new asset class. And on to the next slide around the risks during the operation phase are very much twofold. It's getting the production out, so getting your volume that you expected to be able to make. So it's down to managing your availability, being able to get the right efficiency and yield, and maybe having some guarantees from the technology providers around the performance of the new asset. Being able to project future maintenance and reliability costs on a brand new asset are going to be key to being able to support what the costs are in maintaining that volume. And power price risk is obviously going to be a key one because for electrolysis, for green hydrogen, it's going to be around 70% of your total cost. So it's a key thing to get right. And I think ownership of renewable plant rather than purchasing from other people may well be a more popular avenue for developers to go down. And then on the sales side, it's being able to find customers that can make long-term commitments to purchase that and make corresponding investments in their own infrastructure to be able to receive the gas, to be able to transport the gas, and what the arrangements are around resale of that gas during the initial sales period. And we'll have to deal with getting the physical dispatchability right around outages, whether it's at customer facilities or production facilities, around force majeure events and things that may go wrong in the real world. And next slide, please. And from a financing perspective, the key thing is going to be trying to attract money from adjacent sectors. So things that are adjacent are going to be power, utilities, natural resources, in the processing sense, and the shipping industry. And being able to get motivated finances from those sectors, as well as being able to access government grants and funding in the early stages, and moving over time through being able to access export credit finance, particularly on larger projects, to be able to provide a significant portion of the capital stack. And there's always going to be an argument to leverage national interest, that when you're putting a bank syndicate together, you're looking for which names in the transaction, whether it's the customer for the commodity can bring its own attract finances because they're involved, or whether it's the manufacturer of the plant can bring banks from their home country or continent that would typically support projects they're involved in. So it's about getting liquidity to be able to bring the project to fruition. So I'll pause there and take questions.
During registration, can you see all these questions, all these 5 questions right now?
I can, yes.
Yes, and with regards to project finance, what are the top 3 criteria do you think is the utmost important?
Well, I think the 3 things are going to be the technology in terms of its quality and ability to perform. It will be the offtake, the sales arrangements for hydrogen, because initially green or blue hydrogen will be more expensive than hydrogen from other sources. So it's an ability to support that initially more expensive product, perhaps through socialization, that most customers in that market are consuming a portion of that initial tranche of hydrogen, and as others cheaper projects come in later, that higher initial cost is able to be borne socially. And 3, I think the supportive nature of the host government and its willingness to permit projects.
Yes.
So, so local stakeholder support is important, and government's really a key player in that space.
Yes, and move on to the second question. How does project financier sees the viability of debt funding for small-scale hydrogen projects? And also, please kindly touch on the big projects.
Yeah, look, project financing really only starts to kick in for projects that scale is above $50 million in size, because the transaction costs in documentation and diligence really provide a barrier to very small projects accessing that as a primary source of funding. But once you get to large scale, it becomes very efficient. In terms of uncertainty of electricity costs, there is the ability to enter into medium to long-term purchasing arrangements for the electricity inputs. So I wouldn't say it's uncertain. You've still got the same ability to lock in a fixed price for a reasonable period of time as a small project as you would have for a larger one. And it's also possible for a small project to construct its own electricity assets as well as the hydrogen plant.
And what about the large-scale projects? Because also to large-scale projects, they are also subject to an absence of the carbon pricing mechanism, I think.
I mean, that's right. A carbon pricing mechanism would provide a very clear route to providing support for this sort of industry. But the arrangements for very large-scale projects become more complex, because they can invest in building new renewable assets, whether it's owned by the project company or a third party. And you start to get into some broader issues around costs, that the transmission cost will change over time as the energy network increases in size. We will see progressively new large new transmission investment taking place. So it's quite exciting for the network companies as well, because there's a lot of growth. But we could see the average age of the network becoming much younger, that we've really got a network that hasn't had a lot of investment for the last 20 years in large upgrades. We've had smaller debottlenecking type investments, but no really large major investments like Energy Connect or the HumeLink built for some time. So we'll see an increase in the regulatory asset bases of the network companies to support that different flow of production from new power stations and providing the security of supply. But we may see larger projects actually choosing to go off grid for a large part of their costs, because they may try to avoid paying for a large amount of shared network costs and rely on a much smaller network of their own close to the production facilities, if they're able to get reasonable co-location of renewables to the hydrogen production facility. So you'd only be funding, your share of 100 kilometers rather than your share of a diverse network that's got many, many users on it.
Yes. And to the third question, what mechanism of tariff structure of hydrogen energy would be normal in the future?
I think that's for the market to find out, and we may see attempts to parallel for the export industry the arrangements that have been made for LNG, but over time. But at the moment, we don't really have an international benchmark price for hydrogen or even for ammonia that would be recognisable for putting those sort of contracts on. I think the key features are going to be more around take or pay contracts, because you're making very large investments in infrastructure for those export projects. So I think it's for the market to find out what works for it.
Yes. And the fourth question, how is your view on hydrogen investment capex and the trend of break-even point? I think that has been touched before, because there are a lot of different types of hydrogen and there are a lot of different scenarios of the project. It's really a difficult question to answer. Jeremy, would you like to take some insights on it?
Yeah, it is definitely a very difficult bet to take, which type of technology is going to be the best, and how quickly that learning and investment in research and development is going to pay off. And I think you have to take an open mind at this point and expect some surprises along the way, that it could well be quicker than some people are saying, because there just seems to be a real keen interest from a lot of very skilled and capable companies and individuals to drive the technology along and try and discover some breakthroughs that help. So I think just that level of international interest that I touched on earlier this afternoon, that breadth of interest and from lots of different sectors bringing different insights can maybe drive that technology pace faster than people are projecting at the moment.
Yes, and the last question, in what areas do you see H2 offtake or demand being the greatest?
Look, I think heavy transport, whether it's marine transport, train networks that haven't been electrolyzed, so thinking that not the mainline routes or the urban metro networks where it's electrified, but smaller, less travelled parts of the railway network in Europe in particular, but also in Asia. Probably less relevant in Australia, that our rail network, other than for freight, particularly in the iron ore and coal mining sectors, would be domestic examples where you're competing against diesel fuels with higher costs, and I think shipping, railways and heavy road transport would probably be the first sectors to actually give significant demand. And I think the next big wave is that displacement of some of the natural gas use in colder climates.
Yes, and there are another 5 questions in the Q&A box remaining for your address. They are all about long-term offtake agreements in relations to mobility, in relations to hydrogen vehicles and large-scale projects. Perhaps you can also stay for a longer time and help address these questions through words or letters, because we don't have enough time to accommodate all these questions live.
Thanks, Molly, and I'll have a look at those while we're moving on to the next speaker.